Mary, I think we'll go ahead and get started. Hi, everyone. Welcome to the League of Women Voters February 2023 Lunch and Learn program. I'm Robin Schmidt, president of the League of Women Voters of the La Crosse area. And I want to thank you for joining us. We're excited to have you with us today to hear from Troy Gunderson about public education funding and spending and implications of both. The League of Women Voters advocates for a strong public education system, which in turn builds strong and healthy communities. Speaking of strong and healthy communities, I do want to say happy birthday to the League of Women Voters. 103 years ago today, the League was established in Chicago 6 months before the 19th Amendment was ratified, giving women the right to vote. The League was actually formed from the National American Women's Suffrage Association, which was founded in 1890, which is 133 years ago. And that was led by formidable women, including Susan B. Anthony and Carrie Chapman Catt. So we come from a long line of women advocating for voting rights. But we should also remember that the 19th Amendment didn't eliminate state poll tax and literacy test requirements. And it wasn't until 1965 with the Voting Rights Act that truly allowed all women to vote. And while we'd like to say our work is done, I think that we know right now that it's really important to make sure that voters have access to voting and are not disenfranchised from the process. Our mission of empowering voters and defending democracy is relevant and just as needed today. So happy birthday to the League, and thanks to all of you for being here. You're helping us fulfill our mission through this program. Also want to remind you that a week from today is the primary election. So speaking of voting rights, implement your rights, use your right by going to the polls and casting your vote next week, or drop off your ballot early and vote early if you prefer. So for today's presentation, we're going to ask that you type your questions into the question box at the bottom of your screen. And at the end of the presentation, when Mr. Gunderson has completed his presentation, we'll have time for questions and answers. The League of Women Voters is a nonpartisan political organization. We encourage the informed and active participation of citizens in government. And we work to increase the understanding on major public policy issues and influence public policy through education and advocacy. We take action on public policy positions that are established through member study and consensus. As an organization, we never support or oppose any political party or any candidate. I want to thank Leslie Wagner for her work on this program, and I'm going to turn it over to Leslie to introduce our speaker. Thank you.
Thanks, Robin, and welcome everyone. Along with Robin's mention of today's birthday of the League of Women Voters, I think it's significant to note that our advocacy of public education goes back nearly that far. Since 1927, the League has been active in studying and promoting improvement of the public school system in our state. We have long supported equal educational opportunity for Wisconsin's children through an equitable state aids formula that includes retaining program and personnel responsibilities in the local district. Last year, the Wisconsin Policy Forum reported that our state's per pupil pre-K through 12 school spending continues to fall below the national average. State and local taxes represent the primary funding source for pre-K through 12 public education in Wisconsin, as well as nationally. And that relationship makes for very challenging decisions and trade-offs. We are about to see that play out in Madison as the legislature begins deliberations on the next 2-year state budget. Our speaker today, Troy Gunderson, is former superintendent of the West Salem School District, and he was also a 2021 candidate for Wisconsin Superintendent of Public Instruction. Troy's 35-year career in public education includes serving as a classroom teacher, a high school principal, and district superintendent, which gives him a broad perspective on the pressures facing educators, as well as how public policy actions affect the capacity to serve and educate students. So Troy, we look forward to learning a lot from you today. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody, for inviting me today. And thank you for your interest in this topic. We're at an unusual time in my business, and it takes all of us to get involved in that. Public education, there's a word public in it for a purpose, and we all make up the public. And so you have to pay attention to that. And I just thank you for taking an interest in that topic. Just a couple of things today before we dig into where we are today. How did we get here? Wisconsin's Constitution, we're talking about history, 150 some years ago or whatever. The legislature shall provide by law for the establishment of district schools, which shall be nearly uniform as practicable. And so we argue about that a lot. How do we make the schools the same across our state? And that's been sort of the founding notion that if you go to school in Siren, it should be the same as if you're in Madison. And we've worked hard at that over the years. In the history of our business, about the time of Susan B. Anthony and the 19th Amendment, we decided we would have universal free high school in the United States. And that was quite a change from the East Coast model of going to private schools. And if you look around Wisconsin, a lot of high schools were built between 1915 and 1925. Then in the 1950s, our business was really rocked and changed by Brown versus the board, where we could no longer discriminate and place especially African-American students in the South in their own schools. And that's a fight that still goes on today. In the 1960s in Wisconsin, we consolidated our school districts. Before that, you could kind of pick where you went to high school, and we created the school districts that we have today and connected them to their own tax base, and then rearranged our state funding to be able to service that. In the 1970s, the unions became more powerful, and teaching went from a service model job to a professional job. The profession was dominated by women, and there was an unbelievable amount of sexism and discrimination in our profession that the union helped put back. And we got things like pay and longevity and training, and really professionalized that entire thing. By the 1980s, the farm economy had gone awry, and property taxes were askew in the state of Wisconsin, depending upon where you lived. And so that was really the political agenda of the day. And by the 1990s, they passed something called the three-legged stool in Madison, which they developed a revenue limit to control how much money you could raise every year. They expanded their equalization aid, which is a way in which they give more aid to poor districts, less aid to rich districts, and a way of attempting to make property taxes more uniform in the state. We call it the Robin Hood method. It works really well when we follow it. And then they paired that up with a qualified economic offer, which is a way of controlling settlements with the unions. And it began that sort of battle around that that began in the early 1990s. At 2010, there was another landmark thing in our state when then Governor Walker and the more conservative end of our politics eliminated bargaining rights and began sending out vouchers to kids and controlling spending, dramatically lowering spending. Their ideological goal is just to pay less taxes. And I think we see that as a result of 40 years of baby boomers voting. To be honest with you, we've become much averse to taxes. And so one of the easiest ways to get elected is to say you'll cut taxes. And for the most part, people have done that. And then we see whether it's the village can't afford to build a new street, or the school's out of money, or the university tuition goes up, all of those things, we have reduced funding in the past 30 years and basically changed our state that way. Where does that leave us today? I think our money is under the revenue limits. And when they were put in place in the 1990s, they locked people in at their current spending levels. So places like Melrose, Mindoro was locked at the bottom of the state. West Salem was pretty low spending as well. And places in the affluent suburbs of Milwaukee were at the high end. And so you've been locked into this pattern for 30 years. They haven't changed them much, because anytime you tinker with that, there's winners and losers, and the politics of that are just untenable. So they leave it alone. They have recently tried to raise the bottom, but in doing that, you raise their property taxes. So it's been a bit of a difficult thing. Our wages are still are now capped by the CPI, and it's sort of the Wild West in the wage game in the school business now, because the unions had uniformed the way people were paid, and now they're paid differently depending upon where they go. And so it's more of a bargaining, recruiting, different way in which people are paid, and there's good and bad in that. I'm afraid the inequities of the 50 years ago are going to show up, where the male high school science teacher makes more than the female first grade teacher, and we're holding our breath on that. Leslie alluded to it earlier, we've dropped from 11th in the nation in school spending to 25th. And there's been a precipitous drop since 2016. And we're continuing as the economy turned around, other states that reinvested in education and we did not. And so we've been getting passed by a number of people each year annually. She also talked about taxes, how we pay for public education. It basically boils down to, since the revenue limit is made up of your property taxes and state aid, that we pay for public education by combining local property taxes with aid from the state of Wisconsin. In 1980, I'm 60 years old. In 1980, when I graduated from high school, the average Wisconsinite paid 13% of their income in property and income taxes. This was down to 11.2% by 2002, primarily because of the work in the 1990s with the three-legged stool. We had lowered property taxes. It's now down to 10.3%. And so that's a 10% reduction just in the last 20 years. And you think about that, doesn't sound like much, but we're talking about billions of dollars. We each year reduce our willingness to pay. We reduce our commitment. And so the state legislators then are forced to decide where to spend that money. And so they reduce money at the colleges. They send less of it back to your local municipality to fix the street, all of those things. And they offered school districts a way to get around that, and that's by hosting a revenue limit referenda. So you ask the people in town, would it be okay if we tax more to exceed the limit? And each election cycle, there are sometimes more than 100 out of 420 school districts asking for more money. Those elections tend to be easier to pass because maybe a middle of the road politically leaning person doesn't want to vote yes on a statewide issue because they don't want money to go to Madison, but they'll support their local school. And so you tend to have more success rates on that. And so, but it has turned school districts into like little political engines. If you're a superintendent, you end up spending a lot of time running a referendum, and it's pretty high stakes because if it fails, they freeze your dollar amount for 3 years. And of course you have to make the cuts then because you're out of money. So I think of all my time as a superintendent, the most pressure packed things are election nights, because again, if it fails, you're looking at, reducing staff, letting them go, cutting services, and then having to wait in order to ask again. So you're in sort of purgatory for a long time. Other things that are impacting our state that we should think about, demographics. The demographics in our state, there are more and more people that look like me and less in the age that are having babies. And so our birth rate has declined precipitously. We are producing fewer children. And those who live here migrate to the suburban areas. If you think about this, think about Sun Prairie, Verona, Holman, places like Pewaukee, any place around the metro centers. Well, the metro centers inside La Crosse, Milwaukee, Madison, they all sort of struggle with their school systems, and the suburbs have the money. In our area, in the La Crosse area, I spoke to their superintendent the other day, and I think within a decade, there'll be more students in the Holman School District than the La Crosse School District. And so you think about them being out of money. You think about them having too many buildings. They're all old. All of the politics in La Crosse around fixing that, just take that times 100, and that's Milwaukee. The same thing happens all over the state. Speaking of Milwaukee, MPS, and if you think about Milwaukee Public Schools, Racine, Kenosha, they make up almost a third of our student population in southeastern Wisconsin, so including the suburbs. How do we navigate that whole metro area? And if you think about MPS in particular, they're just like La Crosse. They have declining enrollment, aging facilities, changing demographics. I met with their superintendent 3 years ago, and he told me they pay people to translate their materials in 14 languages. But stop and think about that for a second. They're teaching children in 14 different languages. A city that struggles with racism, the holdovers of their union and their fundings. They're much like Detroit, Cleveland, Chicago, all of those places. But for a whole host of reasons, Milwaukee was just less successful at becoming a multiracial hub. In a national study on attainment of African-American males, and these people put together a complex system where they attempted to figure out what happened to child who was born, and what's the likelihood that if they're born African-American male, that they'll become a productive adult. And they had a complex sociological formula to define what productive is. And then they ranked the states, and Wisconsin ranks 50th. 50th. Stop and think about that. And when you look at the rankings, 47, 48, and 49 are way ahead of us. So not only are we last, we could get twice as good and we'd still be last. That's how far behind we are, the rest of the nation, in terms of African-American male attainment. And I don't know, I mean, nobody can put their finger on it. There's people who have studied the urban metro system down there for a lifetime, but it's really a sad mark on our state in terms of the way we have assimilated people and worked together. And until we are able to figure out ways to make that area, including the suburbs, more successful for everybody, not just affluent white people who live in Pewaukee, we're going to struggle because they make up too big of a slice of our data pool. Private school enrollment moving forward, 30-year decline in private school enrollment across the state. Most of our private schools were connected to the Catholic Church or the Lutheran Church, all the way back to, we used to joke about it, you know, the fight between the Catholics and the Lutherans in Germany, how many ever centuries ago. It's followed us right over here to Wisconsin, and that's where our private schools are. They had lost their grip on their children because it's too expensive to educate kids like that. And declining participation in these churches, they're out of money, all of that kind of stuff. And so the voucher program has really bailed them out and be able to turn that around. The Milwaukee area, if you think about this, the Milwaukee area was an incubation center. They had a test pilot system of the vouchers that went on for about 20 years before we went full time. A lot of data around that. The kids don't perform any better who voucher out. As a matter of fact, if they're below average student, they perform worse because oftentimes they select a school that's less capable of helping them. But they have control over that. They like who they're by, they like their friends. And so the parents, it's sort of a mixed bag of whether or not they like it or not. Oftentimes they do because they have a sense of efficacy around their choice. Rather than here in La Crosse County, if I want my kid to go to Holman, I can open enroll to Holman, or I could move over there. Sometimes in that metro area, you have fewer choices just in your own control over what happens to you because of where you live. So that's an issue that is going to continue to stick with us moving forward. And again, it comes from there. For an example, in La Crosse County, and you folks will understand these districts, there are 5 school districts whose boundaries are included directly in La Crosse County. It's Bangor and Holman, Onalaska, La Crosse, and West Salem. In 2018, there were 125 students in our county collecting a voucher, and collectively the school districts paid $970,000 in aid to promote that in tuition vouchers to the parents, who then spent them at Aquinas, Luther, Cooley Christian, these kind of places in a town. In 2023, at the end of the school year, the bill is going to be $3.7 million for 430 kids. So in 5 years, we went from 125 to 430, and from just under $1 million to 3.7 million. And you can think that that's playing out all over the state in the metro areas. In rural Wisconsin, where they're too far away, people don't go to a parochial school. So this debate is playing out in the Fox Valley, it plays out in Eau Claire, it plays out in Madison, La Crosse, and then southeastern Wisconsin. Before you get to the just wrapped up in all of those sort of what's changing about this, and maybe we all pine for the way it used to be kind of things, but we all know that life moves on. Performance, our kids do very well. Our public schools in West Salem or in Wisconsin are just outstanding. We have a tradition of having highly trained, highly competent teachers. The ones we have somehow survived the pandemic and continue to adapt to a changing cultural norm. The parents are getting different, just like they always have. And you need to stay and continue to change to be on top of that. And so I think sometimes we forget that. You know, from national blue ribbon schools of excellence to award-winning food service programs in West Salem to outstanding ACT scores across the country. in when compared to states where everybody takes it. We just do very, very well. And the mark on us is that, again, African-American males and African-American students in particular in Southeastern Wisconsin lag, and we have got to figure out a way to close that gap. You also alluded to what's going on in Madison right now. We had an election this fall, and the voters in our state chose to stay with the current governor, who has a history of working in my business. And because of the way in which our assembly districts are drawn up and the way in which our population votes and believes, the assembly and Senate are controlled by the other party, which maybe we're all hoping for some sort of stalemate. I don't know why that happens, but it does. The governor wants to take the increased levels of funding and get us back on that path to being a player in public school education. The legislature is opposed to all of that. They want to use the money to further tax breaks. They want to continue to drive down the portions of taxes that we spend. And I'm on a village committee here in West Salem. They're going to run a referendum to pay for their police department. And I've said that when are we going to pay on, when are our taxes going to be low enough that we're satisfied? When are our services going to be at the level where we can't function? The village of West Salem cannot fix a street. They can't pay their police department. Their state aid's been cut dramatically. They can't fund anything. And so they're at the desperation point of a referendum. And I know they've had the same discussions in Holman. Alaska and La Crosse are a little different, but we really need to think about what we're doing with that. I think specifically, and so if I was going to, just one more thing, if I was going to call Steve Doyle on the phone or Brad Paff on the phone, I would say raise the revenue limit. Let these students, let these school districts catch up with CPI. You know, we're going to have an inflation index of 7%, so they got to buy books, teachers, bus, gasoline, all of that stuff, and you're capping them. They don't have any money. And we don't want the money in per pupil. They give you money just straight up cash for a kid, and that's we'll talk about that in a second. That's reversing Robin Hood. So raise the revenue limit would be what I'd tell them if I was on the phone. Somebody asked about federal pandemic dollars. That stuff will sunset. That money will be gone. And quite frankly, it should be. We shouldn't be reliant on the federal government to fund our public schools. How will we respond when the crisis is over? What will we do to fill in that gap? And will those people lose their jobs? Will the programs be cut? Should they change them? These are the discussions. I was in Prairie du Chien last night, and they've got about $600,000 worth of stuff that they're spending, whether it's tutors or additional teachers. That all comes to the end, and they're going to have to decide what they're going to keep and what they're not, because the federal money is gone, which it should be, as I said. I would advocate for more targeted money. Since Act 10 in 2010, the Republicans mostly had been sending what are called per pupil dollars. So they send you so much per kid, regardless of who you are, rather than the equalization approach that creates fairness. And so that, if you think about it, we're sending the same money to Mequon, Thiensville that we are Sparta. And that's just not right. And I think we should use that money, and I advocated for this in my campaign, and we've done a little bit of this, to target things like poverty, English language development, mental health, especially in rural locations. So again, if you think about it, instead of sending everybody the same check for the student, let's send more money to a place where they have children in poverty, or kids suffer with mental health, or the language barriers. They're coming from all over. We should be able to serve that. Teacher shortage will be another thing. It's just like every industry in Wisconsin. Where are we going to get the next generation when the baby boomers are all quit? Where are the next people going to come from? Historically, in the education profession, these people come from families with lower income status to start with. In short, growing up, they viewed public education as a way up the ladder of economic status, and they viewed the lifestyle of a teacher as being better than the one that they have. But those folks need college to be cheap. Otherwise, they can't do it. And so we have a whole state full of people in their early 20s who would like to be teachers, but simply can't afford it. And they're not going to go into that kind of debt for a job that pays that wage to come out the other end. We have two paraprofessionals in our elementary school in West Salem. I substitute there. And again, they'd love to be teachers, but they can't. They're not going to tackle that cost of that. We have to think about how we do that, what it costs to become a teacher. Vouchers, I alluded to that earlier. Public education is really our collective commitment to the common good. And people will tell me that, well, I pay taxes, I should get a voucher. Well, your taxes aren't your tuition. Your taxes are your commitment to educating everybody. And I always use my own two children for an example. They're in their 30s now, but being a school superintendent, I figured out what it cost. They started in kindergarten here in West Salem, and they both graduated from UW-Madison. The taxpayers paid about $140,000 a piece for these young women to be educated. There's no way I've paid $280,000 worth of taxes in that time. And I was a school superintendent. My wife was a teacher, so we paid taxes. You just don't pay enough to cover your own child. So most people in Wisconsin don't pay enough to cover their own child. So the notion that you're paying for that experience is laughable, because you're not. And it's sort of like saying, here in West Salem, we have a park down the street, but I don't like the park because I don't like how you take care of it. I don't like who else goes there. So I'm going to put a swing set in my backyard. So can I get a voucher? I pay taxes. I should get a voucher for my swing set. How about the snow blower I had to buy for my driveway? After all, I pay taxes, and I shouldn't have to buy a snowblower to fix my driveway. I should get a voucher for that. We need to think about this a little differently. Again, education is about your kid. It's about everybody's kid. She alluded to this a little bit earlier. We're thinking about the culture wars. I mean, this is just worse every day in terms of where this is going to come up. I'm not sure how this is going to play out in Madison, but we really need to have honest conversations about these topics without getting into the crazy politics of it. I always think about Wisconsin as a place where indigenous people lived 200 years ago. And in that time, all kinds of people have moved here, whether they're French or German or Scandinavian or Polish or whoever came here. And now it's Hispanics and African-Americans. And we should celebrate that diversity and enjoy all of that. But we are going to battle about that, and throw in gender identity and which books are in the library, and it starts to get kind of goofy. The culture war in this country will filter into all of what we work on. I just think of places like Beloit, Beloit, Wisconsin. So Beloit's French, of course. We settle there, and then we create these factories, and we need workers. So the African-American population from Beloit all came from Mississippi, and they needed to work. They needed workers. They didn't have enough people to work. And so that's always been the case, that we've imported people for all kinds of reasons, to work, to live, and it's not going to be the same. And I think people have to let go of that and celebrate that difference. I think about our state just having one of the finest public education systems in the whole country. We were formed at the right time. As I said, the East Coast had a European bias where rich people had different education. By the time the development of our country got to the middle, there was a more egalitarian approach to things, and that's how our Constitution ended up looking like that. Our public school system was outstanding. As you filter out to the West, as things got later, they got more disparate in their attempts. They're not as uniform. They've tried different things out there. And our success and our traditions fueled our economic growth and made this wonderful state, in both economically and socially, a wonderful place to live. And I think today, and this is my opinion, we struggle with changing demographics and the inevitable economic shifts that come with this change. If I close my eyes and I think about 2040, is Wisconsin just full of older, more segregated, more aggrieved, Klanized people sitting around complaining about the government and really suffering as we lose our place in our country and be passed? Our weather works against us. People move out. We have more people moving out than moving in. Or could we be a multicultural hub of a regenerated economic opportunities with the whole state coming back to life? I always like to point this out, and we live in this area, so I think the best example of what tomorrow could be in our state is to go up to Arcadia. Okay, so here we are. When I came to this area 35 years ago, we used to make a joke that you had to learn how to speak Arcadian because there were so many people with a Polish accent, you couldn't understand them. During my campaign, I went up there 2 years ago, and I ate lunch with the middle schoolers. And there were 150 or so kids in the lunchroom at that time, and about 120 of them were Hispanic. So in 30 years, that town went from everybody's last name was Slabajeski to everybody's last name being Rodriguez. And you've got conservative people there connected to Ashley Furniture who are working to advance the school system and connect them because they want the workers. You've got liberal people who want to see farm economies grow. I just think they've been able to completely change their town, whether they set out to do that or not. And how is it that the rest of us can't do that? How is it that we can't be more like that in terms of who we accept and what we do? And of course, the key driver in the whole town is the public school. The folks view this as a way to get out, and the folks at Ashley are viewing this as a way to find workers. It's really an interesting little petri dish of how this could be done, and I think we should keep an eye on this. I think that public education, our societies at a crossroads, and public education is really the key. We're the place where people mix to become one. 150 years ago, when my ancestors came here, they couldn't wait to get there. They wanted to get rid of their Norwegian accent or their German accent and learn how to be from here. And the notion that for the next 100 years, everybody's going to wear cheese hats and eat bratwurst is laughable. This is going to be different cultures, and that's what makes it great. Public education is the place where we mix and we learn to appreciate. And so I think we all need to stand up, or what will happen is that, the ideology is a peer voucher system where every parent is given a check and they can spend it anywhere. And there really is no obligation to share, to pair, to commingle, to do any of that. And it really becomes a clanonized place of separated by the haves and have-nots. And I don't think any of us like that. And if we don't stand up, pretty soon it'll be too late to turn that back. That's probably enough of me ranting about public education. I could talk about that forever, but I just think that the politics of the money are at hand down there today, and we really need to be calling in and supporting that, that fixing or regenerating our public schools is a priority rather than another tax break.
Troy, thank you so much. We do have questions. I know some of our hosts have questions, and we've got some questions coming in through our box. So I think what I'll first do is let's look at the ones that have come in so far on our question box. The question is there data on literacy rates and black males for Wisconsin? Yes,
I don't have it offhand, but a lot of that at the DPI and the rates, and of course, what are we doing? What are we trying to do? And what's the list of things that they've tried to do to alter that? The sociologists and the demographers and all the people looking at southeastern Wisconsin in particular. It's not for a lack of trying. It's not for a lack of serious people who spent their life trying to move the needle down there. It's just a problem that is sort of baked in down there, and they're struggling with it. But I guess the short answer to the question is yes, they're tracking that data.
All right. Here's another question. One of our members of the audience indicates that they were listening to Wisconsin Public Radio and heard a legislator from Kansas highlighting a bill to move education from their state Department of Education to the state treasurer because she felt the education department was biased and the treasurer would not be biased. Has this been talked about at all in Wisconsin?
No. What's happened here, of course, is, the office that I ran for, state superintendent, is in our Constitution. And the powers that be in Madison have done a lot of what they could to try to strip that office of its power by cutting their funding. So they have very few people working there now, that kind of thing, to eliminate their thing. Other states will have a secretary of education that the governor appoints, and the education department is run underneath the administrative department. I alluded to earlier, when about the time we were formed as the state, wielding the power of who decided who got a school and where that school would be was an enormous political lever. If you think about all those rural schools and where they all got planted out in the country. And so keeping that person separate from the politics of the legislature was important, and that's how it got to be that way. But I haven't heard of anything like that, but I would think that for lack of a better way of saying it, the politicians in our state who are opposed to the work at the DPI, they don't view them as a threat because they've taken away the monetary control already.
So here's another question. Literacy instruction is again in the national conversation, and early reading legislation has been proposed in the state legislature. How should we be considering a relationship between literacy and equity without partisan divisions?
Yeah, well, reading is the most important gig, and there's a little bit of not a little bit within the expert of learning how to people teaching reading. There's this debate between whole language and phonics and how you approach these things. And the experts that I talk to, and I was a high school math teacher, will tell me that, every brain's a little different. And we sort of have a mix of all of that's the way it works the best. And we get in there and have at it. And then, the politicians will grab onto one or the other and say, we need all of this or all of that. And because it makes a good soundbite, and admitting that there's pluses and minuses for everybody isn't a good political sell. But people that I talk to who are into this, and if you go to the state reading convention, those people are debating that and battling pretty aggressively against one side or the other in terms of the topic. The people that I've talked to and learned from, every kid needs a little bit different. And so if a teacher's going to be good, they got to understand all of that and sort of mix it together and use the language that they read, but also the drill and practice of being able to decode, sound things out, that kind of stuff. And so there's that. And from a cultural system, I think there's a cultural bias to a lot of the text that we use. And there's people at UW-Madison have done a lot of research on, attempting to wax out some of the cultural bias or create more culturally appropriate literature for all facets of our communities so that they can do better. And then is there particular ways that, for lack of a better way of saying it, African-American males would learn to read better if we took a different approach, and they're studying away at that. But for the most part, we've agreed that having skills in all of the areas for the teacher and mixing them together is the best way to move the needle forward. And then using the data to look at the kid, what's working for this child, and then take the tool out that they need.
Perfect, thank you. Leslie, I think that you had indicated that you had a question you'd like to ask.
Well, actually, I have a couple of questions now after,
Yeah.
after listening to Troy. And one was, I found it was very interesting what you were saying about referendums and how the tilt towards having to run a referendum to meet the needs of your district is becoming an ongoing thing now around the state. And it's something that was sort of alluded to in this report by the policy forum, that they were saying because this trend and the fact that so many referendums have been successful could correlate to voters being okay with school spending and not satisfied with how school spending is being restricted at the state level. And I'm just wondering, how you felt about that, or what you were getting from people when you were out and about campaigning.
Yeah, a couple of things. In the last budget cycle on that, it's that fact that you just described that helped the Republican side of the debate move forward and cave in a little bit to Governor Evers' desire to put more money in them, because there's two areas of Republican hotbed in Wisconsin. It's suburban Milwaukee, or suburban anywhere, and rural. And they have a very different view on that. And so I grew up in a little town called Colfax, Wisconsin, in northern Wisconsin. And I'll tell you, you can do all kinds of things, but if you touch their school, you're in trouble. And so the conservative that they elect is hearing that when he goes home and he gets down to Madison and says, listen, we can't just throw all the schools under the bus, so people back home aren't going to forgive me for that. And so they like a little bit of that. As I alluded to earlier, folks are more eager or willing to spend money on their own school if they think they've got control over it. The problem in Madison is that if you pass a referendum like we did in West Salem, let's say we're going to spend $1 million more in expenses, then we're going to get state aid on that the following year. And so they have to bake that into their system in terms of how are they going to cover the amount that they're owed because we spent the money. what they've done to try to reel you in then is if you fail, you're locked. Your revenue cap is locked for the 3 years unless you pass another effort, unless you can get people to vote yes, which is awfully painful. And or you have to wait at least a year to do it again. So you can't just keep running them over and over again. And so I think funding by referendum is a double-edged sword. One, for me, I found that the people in West Salem know more about school funding today than they ever did before because I was out talking about it all the time. But the stakes become so high because you quickly get to the point where how would you ever overcome a failure? And that's where we're at in Wisconsin. So it's a pretty pressure-packed thing.
Robin, just to follow up on that, and this is just a thought bubble because we are, a week away from Election Day. And I just wanted to ask Troy maybe if he would share a little bit about his experience in running for, you've alluded to it a couple of times, running for statewide office in a nonpartisan campaign for a nonpartisan office. And I'm just wondering, what did you find to be the most surprising or inspiring or challenging thing you learned about Wisconsin voters?
Well, the most inspiring thing is that the percentage of them that are incredibly educated about issues. I mean, you go someplace or do a Zoom like this and the questions people would ask, like, holy cow, this person, they know what they're talking about, or they wouldn't ask that question. So there's a lot of that. The problem with the state superintendent race is it always happens in the odd year right after the presidential election. And so you get a little voter fatigue, as you can imagine, in the fall. So in the fall of 2020, I'm calling people and asking them for money for the spring of 21. And hey, will you vote? And they're like, what? I got to keep track of the president, the governor, all of that. And so it's a little bit of a timing issue for that. It's a tough market to get statewide coverage. And these are mistakes that I made. I mean, quite frankly, if you're talking about a statewide race, the people live from Madison south almost. You have to be able to connect in the Milwaukee market because that's where the voters are. And I tended to look at that a little differently. Like if I could connect around the state, you could balance that out in terms of you wouldn't be disconnected. It wasn't a we, they kind of thing, but just being able to get in that market is difficult. The primary that's going to happen next week will be decided by whoever is able to get people to vote. So what I mean by that is my primary, I did probably 100 Zooms like this, and we talked to people all over the state, and we had a texting campaign, and we were on the internet and all this kind of stuff. And then a week before, the teachers union sends out a statewide email directing people and retired and working folks, here's the one we've picked, vote for that person. And then the Republican Party sent out a email to all of the Republicans. And I noticed my dad's like, hey, you're going to vote for my kid. He lives up in Menominee. Oh, you're going to vote for my kid. He's running for a state superintendent. And the person said, well, no, I just got an email yesterday telling me to vote for this person because they're in the Republican Party. They didn't know any of the people, could care. I mean, you have any, but they're doing their duty because they're on Team R, and they said vote for this person. And then once the primary's over, then Team R and Team D both played. And so now there was a liberal and a conservative. It always comes down to two like that. And then the conservative candidate got money from all over the country from people who were supporting vouchers and choice, because that's what she said she would do. And the lady who's now the superintendent, she got money from left-wing groups who hate vouchers, and she got money from the teachers union and dwarfed the other person in expenses because the conservative movement wasn't going to give as much money because they don't see the position as having something that'll get something back for them. This judge race will be way different because if you think about school vouchers, the most important decision is when it goes to the Supreme Court and they rule that it's legal. So you have to own the judge, not the state superintendent in that discussion. And so we're now at this position, this current judge is going to be, you'll end up with a conservative and a liberal after Tuesday, and the winner is going to tip the balance of the court. And so there'll be a lot of money available in this one, a lot of national money, because they're going to decide issues like abortion and voting, and it's going to get a lot of national attention. But back to your initial question, it's a bigger state than you think it is, with way different markets. Green Bay is way different than Milwaukee, and the whole northwestern side of the state gets all of their TV and marketing from the Twin Cities, all of their news from Minneapolis. And so it's a kind of a tough thing to put together. You got to have money or you won't pull it off.
Thanks, Trey. I've got a few more questions, and Mary, can you just nod your head if you have questions too? Okay, so one of the questions that came in is asking if you could discuss the role of the Board of Education in local school districts, and how should we assist and recruit and support local school boards in the face of outside money and people influencing the community?
Yeah, we're attempting to take the political culture wars right down to the school board. And in my time, they really haven't been partisan. We would have a mix of people, and unless you'd been to every board meeting for a year, you'd hard time to figure out who was a liberal and who was a conservative, depending upon how they voted. And that was always interesting to me, and I was always appreciative of that. First of all, those people are public servants. We should be recruiting just good-natured people, because there isn't a lot of left or right to the actual decisions that they make. What we see in the pandemic was an empowering, and some of that's kind of sad because it could be a good thing, empowering voters, and in this case, parents who sat home because they were trapped at home and they watched the school board meeting on the YouTube and got encouraged to weigh in. Then, put your face on the Zoom and weigh in. And then when the meetings were live again, they come to the meetings about all kinds of issues. Oh, just recently in West Salem, they had kids make mistakes, and some kid got disciplined for something at the high school. And the next thing you know, the whole boardroom full of people complaining about one way or the other what happened. And, that kind of stuff never used to happen. We would have people call about, taxes or money, or I don't like the football coach, but now they could storm the place and talk about a book in the library, or, we know where you live kind of thing, when it came down to shots and masks and COVID. And so it got to be pretty intense, and it brings out both sides. So all the way back, we should be recruiting good people, and their left and right politics aren't as important as you think they would be. What you'd want to know is if they really care about your community and they want to see kids do well. Because like you probably figure out through these conversations, I end up being a pretty liberal person when it comes to school. I believe in the government. I work for the government. I don't make apologies for that. But we had some wonderful school board members that were real conservative, and they helped me think about the way in which we were approaching money or taxes. And some who were like super liberal, wanting to save everybody. And I'd have to tell them, well, yeah, it's great and everything, but we can't afford all of that. And so there was a good balance and a good mix. But the thing they had in common was they all cared about the town. They all cared about the school. They all cared about kids. The negative of what you'll get is, in this recent thing, we're going to take over the board in a culture war kind of thing. And so the only reason they got on there is for one particular issue, or they want to disrupt, or they want to tear the system down. They're against this or against that. And boy, that makes just miserable. You lose track of the kids, you lose track of the whole business very quickly. So we should be recruiting candidates who care about kids, care about their community. The nonpartisan work of this group would be perfect, because we need people from all sides. Otherwise, you get tunnel vision. And we should remind everyone else that it's community service. These people aren't, they're not becoming millionaires because they got on the school board. They're giving back to their community, and we should honor and respect them, not be so aggressive. Social media is a tough gig for them. Man, they get attacked. It never used to be like that. I mean, school board members in my office just emotionally wrecked because they go on Facebook and they're just being, eviscerated over crazy stuff. Doesn't have anything to do with school. And so it gets to be tough to be in the public eye.
Mary, I know you nodded your head. You had a couple questions. I've got some, and we have a couple more that have come in on our line. So go ahead, Mary.
All right. Well, there's one from the audience that asks if you could repeat some of the figures you gave on the reduction of school funding and the ranking of school funding compared to other states. You mentioned a percent reduction that is currently 10%, but
okay, a couple of things. Wisconsin was 11th in the nation, 11th in 2002, and this is on the Wisconsin Policy Forum. They're the data geeks in Wisconsin that has all this. And according to them, we just got to 25th. So we're at the midway point, and their data will explain to you that no state in the union has went back 23 spaces in that amount of time. We've lost more ground than anybody else in the last 20 years. And the other one is they print out stats on tax burden, and because this is one of the things you look at, you know, where am I going to locate my business? Where do I want, where's the tax burden, and what is the tax burden? And, you know, their most updated figures for the last, you know, for the last 20 years, again, 11.2% of the average wage earner. So if you take the average annual income of someone and then what the average property tax was and the average income tax was, it comes out to a tax burden of 11.3%. And now it's down to, or 11.2, and now it's down to 10.3. And that's not just a 0.9% reduction. That's a 10% reduction, because you're going from 11 to 10. You've backed up considerably. And there was a similar article that had it. It was more in the, you know, the area of 13 when I was a kid, but so much changed in the 80s and 90s. It's not apples to oranges. But the last 20 years, it really shows that we continue on a pretty steady pace of reducing our commitment to government of any sort. Was that the only stats I think I gave? Maybe.
I think so.
Yeah, we went from 11th to 25th, and 11.2% down to 10.3% in that time period in terms of what we pay.
I have another question that kind of goes along with the funding. You talked quite a bit about the voucher system. Can you is there a difference in the amount of monies that a student who is on a voucher gets as compared to a student who is going to the public school as far as funding?
Yes, yeah. Yeah, they get a straight up dollar amount. I'm not, you know, I'm a little bit out of that business now, so I'm not sure exactly what that number is. I'd have to look it up, but I think it's about the average that a person gets in state aid. And so it's $7,500, I think it was, and it's probably closer to 8,000 now per kid, but don't quote me on that. I don't know that number. You get, they'll get more if they're special ed. So this is to start with, the vouchers were just regular ed, and then, you know, well, I've got 3 children and one of them has a handicap and they can't go to the private school because they don't have the program. We can't afford it. You know, like if you think about a kid who's medically fragile or cognitively disabled, it costs a lot more to educate them. You need helpers, aides, paras, teachers, that kind of thing. And so we passed a special ed voucher thing, which nationally other states have done this. This is a bit of a disaster because well, they cherry pick. But anyway, in Wisconsin, you get more if you have special education student than you do regular ed. Well, what that looks like is by federal statute, the public school is responsible for evaluating them, because special ed money is connected, at least the base rate of that and the laws around that are connected to the federal government for discrimination. So here in West Salem, we have a private school, Cooley Christian. They go online and they start taking vouchers, and I don't know what their number is today, but it's quite a few, maybe 60. So 60 times 7,000, $400,000. And then if they have a student that they think is maybe special education, then they can call up and request that we come over and evaluate them. And then if they qualify, then they get more. They'll get $11,000 or $12,000 instead of 7 or 8. And then they can decide whether they want to provide the service. There's the part that gets under my skin a little bit, is they don't have to provide any service. They just get more money, and they can provide a service if they want, but they don't have to. And so, I mean, this is just information. They took in 27 kids, and on the 3rd week of school called and wanted 19 of them evaluated for speech. Now, you tell me that they all need speech. So we had to march over there and evaluate them, and we found some that did need services, and then they get more money. And then did they provide service? I don't know. We don't know if they do or not. Our work is done. We selected them, and then they get more money. They're having trouble with certified teachers, just like we are, but worse, because they can't they don't pay at the same rate. So it's a bit of a deal, that's for sure. The program, when it was the law, when it was passed, and this is sort of the sinister part of the thing, or not sinister, it's probably good government. It depends on how you want to look at it. When they passed the voucher expansion, they baked in annual increases to the amount and annual increases to the amount of people who qualify. And so in order to stop this, you'd have to pass a bill that passed a law to change that. And given the makeup of the current Assembly and Senate, the likelihood of that changing is low, because they like this. They see this as the solution.
So am I understanding correctly? So a private voucher, it's every year there is an automatic increase in the amount that a school would get per student.
Mhm.
Is there the same?
No.
Okay, I kind of thought so. All right, I have another question. And some states have statewide curriculums where teachers are told that they have to use this textbook. They have to be teaching these things at a certain time. Does Wisconsin have anything like that, or is there a movement towards doing something like that?
No, and to my knowledge, no. We have traditionally been a local control kind of thing. The state of Wisconsin produces standards, guidelines. How they tacitly control your curriculum is deciding which test you're going to take, and then holding you accountable for results. And so if you're taking this test put out, every fourth grader is going to take this test, then that that's the content of the material you're going to have to cover, or they're not going to be successful. So that's kind of how they control your curriculum, but not to the extent of a lot of the southern states are more typical that way. And that's not a criticism. A lot of that has to do with the development of their states and how their governments were set up following the Civil War. Even you go back that far to think about how they did this. States control the curriculum. So it's famous that there's a Texas state school board that picks the books and everybody has to use it. We see more of that in Florida, with the governor there is getting a lot of national attention for controlling that kind of stuff. In the Midwest, we were settled and formed by far more liberal people that way, who believed in local control of that. And again, the negative of too much diversity is that it's impossible to produce standardized results. So if you are banking your success on standardized achievement, you need to standardize your instruction. This is why on these international statistics show that the United States is 24th in math. And how could possibly 23 people be ahead of us? Well, because the 23 ahead of us are small countries that have one curriculum and everybody does the same thing. We're here, even in Wisconsin, we're not all doing the same thing. So you could have this wide variety, and then you take one test and, we didn't all do well on it. Well, yeah, no kidding. These people weren't prepared at all. And so the short answer to that is no, we're not. The guidelines come from them, the standards come from them, but you have a lot of local variability in how you approach those things and do those things.
Thank you. I just wanted to put in a little FYI on the league, a little boost for the anniversary today. It was because of the league that there is actually a school board in La Crosse, because it used to be every little teeny tiny school had their own people running it. And my dad used to be on a one-room school board. And because of the league, they centralized it so that we have the school district of La Crosse.
Yeah, we're still fighting about the north side. And in our school tomorrow, we're celebrating Susan B. Anthony Day. And of course, she's the person who did credited with the movement that got the 19th Amendment. It's her birthday tomorrow.
So Troy, I have a couple questions as well. You talked a little bit about the literacy rate for African-American males. And I have to wonder, by far the majority of that population is in the Southeast, where there have been historically decades and decades of contamination from lead pipes in the water system. And I'm wondering, has anybody looked at studies of blood lead levels in those students and done any kind of analytical work that shows that there is a physiological reason
Sure.
for why there might be some developmental issues and some learning issues?
Oh, I don't know what happened. Are you seeing me like that? I don't know that. I know the lead pipe discussion came up as part of the federal funding that they got. You know, the money on COVID, the American Relief Plan included digging up these lead pipes highlighted by the stuff in Michigan. Well, it shouldn't be too much of a stretch to imagine that the same thing that happened in Flint is happening in Milwaukee, because they were all settled at the same time. So, you know, there's lead pipes all over the city. And I don't know that they did studies like that. Just for clarity around the information about African Americans, it was an attainment study. So these were longitudinal studies as to whether or not that when they became 25 years old, whether they were working someplace, paying taxes, whether they had lived or they were in prison or all of this kind of stuff. So the data was really complex sociology. So it wasn't just about the school system. It was about the likelihood that child is going to grow up to have a successful and happy life kind of thing. And what role did the school system play in that? So it's not just about literacy rates, it's about all of their opportunities. And so to your question, I don't know. I would guess somebody's looking into that, whether or not we have lead poisoning in these kids, whether they're getting it from their school or their paint or I know they did all the lead paint stuff, but that's a big city. And the motivation to fix certain areas is lower than it is others. I mean, let's just face it. Milwaukee's notorious for their redlining, where they redlined all of the African Americans when they moved there. In other words, they put a red line on the map and said they had to live inside this box. And when you drive down there, you can still see where the box is, because inside the box, the conditions aren't as nice as they are outside the box. We don't have a very good record of our race relations and the way in which we treated that wave of immigrants. And we're paying for that 100 years later, 150 years later.
Thanks. I have one last question. I see we have a couple other questions too, but you talked a little bit about the teacher shortage and the challenges that we have in getting teachers educated. And I guess what I hear sometimes in the media, maybe by politicians, is, well, let's just take anybody and turn them into a teacher, and then we won't have a shortage. And I'm just wondering if you could talk a little bit about the science of teaching and the importance of educating our teachers and having them learn about how children learn and retain information and all of that kind of stuff.
There's a sociological ideology to that, and that is teaching professional? Are teachers professional, like doctors, lawyers, engineers? Are they the guardians of a professional skill? And this sounds awful again, but conservative right-wing America would want you to believe that the answer to that's no. And that back in the day when we had 20-year-old school moms who were fired when they got pregnant, that was the good old days, because we didn't have to pay them and it's not really that hard. But of course, we've spent the last 70 years studying this profession. These people are skilled, highly skilled at what they do. You can tell. They know what they're doing. And so this notion that anybody can do it is laughable. And we're seeing that across the state, because you run out, you don't have teachers. And so now we keep lowering the standard to the point where anybody can stand in and will take at this point for substitutes or whatever. We're letting college kids substitute who say they're thinking about being a teacher, and before you used to have a teacher's license or you couldn't pay them. We've really lowered the standard because we're out of people. And that's a dangerous precedence moving forward, because it bodes to a notion of deprofessionalizing that content area. You walk around and watch the people who are good at this, and they're good at it because they're highly trained, highly skilled, developed professional people. We had a child who was struggling in our elementary the other day. We had a meeting, and this teacher rolled out a book of the purposeful strategies she had tried to engage that child, move them along. I tried this, I tried this, I tried this. That didn't happen in 2 seconds. These people are experts at brain development, emotional development, child behavior, curriculum and content. One of our negatives is we just can't keep educating them enough. You spend a lot of time training and uplifting that group of people, so you have to keep them. So this is one of the debates in our profession. Is it a profession? And historically, it wasn't viewed that way. And like it or not, the union had a lot to do with moving that forward. And we have moved forward. We know, we've studied, we know how to do this. And everybody is looking at these mitigated standards for substitute teachers as temporary until we can get by this crisis. And my response is, well, okay, well, what are you doing about the crisis? Because again, I've got two 20-year-old kids, I call them kids, working in my building who'd love to be teachers but can't afford it. And if you cut taxes again and raise tuition at UW-La Crosse, the likelihood that they're going to become a teacher is low. We have to figure out a way to get them to be a teacher for almost nothing in terms of cost, or we're going to run out. And then it'll justify the deprofessionalization, because once it's deprofessionalized, then they don't, then they can justify not paying you. They can justify private schools without licensed teachers, all of that.
So I think what we'll do, really, thank you so much for all of your time. The last two questions and comments really kind of go to this call to action. You talked about what you'd say in a call to local legislators to raise revenue limits. What are the 2 to 3 most important messages to the legislature regarding the next budget cycle and the use of federal funds that our governor will allocate?
Yeah, well, just what I said. I mean, we've spent the last decade reducing our commitment. Our collective commitment is going backwards. And if we're going to reinvigorate rural Wisconsin or the entire state together, all of us, we need to reinvest. And here's our chance to get back on that. Is how many, raise your hand if you think it's okay that we fell from 11th to 25th. Raise your hand if you think it's okay that the whole country's passing us by in terms of our collective commitment to our children and building education. If we close our eyes and we continue doing that, where do you think you're going to be in another decade? 40th? How low is low enough? When does it stop? What's the right answer? And so I'd be leaning on that person, Brad and Steve, stomp your foot in the ground. We don't need another tax break. We need you to take that money and reinvest so that the kids in Holman and Onalaska and Melman and Bangor can have the services that they need. To be able to continue to produce the kind of citizens that we need to have. Public education is the ticket to all of our future. And without investing in it, that's a no-go. So revenue limit, put that money in there, take the federal money and target it towards individual populations so that we can determine results. And so if we take one-time federal money and we target poverty and language learners and mental health, and we see which system works the best, and when we're putting our own money in there, we'll know where to spend it. Vouchers, find a way to slow that down. If you can, I would attempt to connect any budget negotiation to them clicking that button down a little bit so that slows down, because they're draining our money. That's where the money for education is going. It's coming out of public ed and going to parental choice. Parental choice is how they get around the separation of church and state. They don't give the money to Aquinas. They give the money to your parent, who then gives it to Aquinas.
All right, thank you.
Mhm.
And really, we're very appreciative of just having your insights and background as we think about educational systems and the elections coming up. And there's just, like you said, it's really important to understand the challenges that the schools face. Even if we might not have the ability to change things, it's just really important that we understand what the systems are. I also want to thank Leslie Wagner and the entire program committee for another great program. Thanks to Mary Nugent for doing our spotlighting and our screen sharing. Also, please mark your calendar for Wednesday, March 8th, which is the AAUW program celebrating International Women's Day. This event starts at 5:30 at the UW-La Crosse Student Union. The theme this year is to embracing equity, and there will be panelists representing Jordan, Nigeria, and Honduras. It should be a wonderful program as always. I also wanted to comment that I know many of you are very eager to get back together in person, and our board is meeting later this week to talk about how we transition from all virtual meetings to hybrid meetings for possibly the March members legislative breakfast, which will be at the end of March, and perhaps our April lunch and learn. So more information on that will be forthcoming. And lastly, please help get our messages out by sharing our social media posts. Many of them are focused on Vote 411, voter registration, upcoming elections. And so we appreciate any ability you have to help share that information. And don't forget to vote. Thank you all very much.